for the people, and they are, since we're a representative bureaucracy, they are the representatives of the people. So, and of course, we've talked about this as well. The political narrative has always been that bureaucracies are inherently inefficient because they have so many rules and regulations, which of course are rules and regulations that have been put upon us by the political system to begin with in order to demonstrate further and further issues of equity and make sure that we answer to all the different external stakeholders that require something of us. But based on that, what we have figured out is that we have been trying to, measure what the structure should be all about. And, Gulick talks about the idea of unity of command, the one master, one supervisor, centralized authority, narrow spans of control. I think Chapter 2 discusses this quite, quite a bit, and that's one of the reasons why I made sure that you guys did presentations on them. But one of the things that we figured out is because we are sort of put upon by the politicians and by external stakeholders, we have a contingency perspective to organizations, which means that we tend to develop based on our adapting to the different environmental pressures that are placed upon us, which is interesting because over time we continue, but keeping that in mind, that even though we develop based on the external environmental pressures placed upon us, either by the politicians for greater transparency, or by the politicians for greater oversight, or by internal stakeholders for greater levels of external stakeholders for greater levels of efficiency, we are not operating in a vacuum. We are also being affected, if you will, by scholars of business management who continue to talk about the idea of these flexible organic forms of structure, which means structure that is much more able to maneuver around, if you will, and not bureaucratized or mechanistic. So what we see here is we are continually trying to bring in the literature from all sides, as well as trying to respond to our politicians and external stakeholders, and it seems as though we are trying to stay as much within the game as we can. So the public sector, as I said, continue to follow the lead of the private sector in reforms. And because the national narrative has always been that the public sector is overtly bureaucratized, is too top-heavy, has too many employees, we are constantly undergoing review. So the NPR, the National Performance Review, was ordered to reduce agency rules by 50%. And of course, the only way they could do that was to provide money to a lot of nonprofit agencies to get the work that they could no longer do, or to privatize or involve the private sector in some of their work. So the Winter Commission proposed revitalization of state and public service, and also proposed reduction in rules and more decentralization. Other efforts, of course, have called for flattening the bureaucracy by removing middle layers. Now remember, we constantly ask for that, but every time something new comes up in the environment that requires greater government oversight, we flatten the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy then gets hierarchical again. Bush's president management agenda re-emphasized e-government and competitive outsourcing to make agencies more flexible and adaptive. And e-government works in some cases, in other cases it doesn't work. So we are constantly, as I said, trying to figure out what works best for the public, what works best for our citizens. And that's really important because, again, as I've mentioned earlier, many times in this lecture and in other lectures, we are not these behemoths of closed systems. We are continually trying to reinvent ourselves to best serve the citizens of this country. So what are the dimensions of structure that all organizations have to fall under, and especially for us? So there are many ways. Organizational structures are complex. The book on page 216, 217 gives the different kinds of dimensions: centralization, formalization, red tape, and complexity. And I believe the next slide has that: centralization, formalization, red tape, and complexity. So centralization is the degree to which power and authority concentrate. And usually you have centralization when you need much more singular levels of authority and power. So in organizations where the organization has to move with one thought, right, you may have high levels of centralization. In organizations where the organization can move into many directions, you may have multiple, much more decentralized sort of ideologies. So at the university level, even though it looks like we are highly centralized, and we may be highly centralized in some basic key components like improving rates of retention, improving graduation rates, making sure that we have enough funding to run the university. We may be highly centralized in those aspects, but which programs are we going to offer? How those programs are run? How many students can we have? We have much more decentralization because the power and authority of those kinds of issues are not concentrated at the top. Formalization is the extent to which an organization's structures and procedures are formally established in written rules and regulations. How do you figure out the level of formalization for an organization? Well, the way you figure out formalization is to ask employees how much they follow the rules. In some cases, you follow the rules quite a bit, right? We have to provide a syllabus. We have to, make sure that certain key government mandates are fulfilled, which means that we have to, do the work on Title IX. If I want any sort of money back for any of the trips that I make, I have to follow certain government mandates. So yes, as an employee at the university, there is some high level of formalization and rules and procedures onto those things that the government deems important. Those things that the university doesn't deem important, what am I going to wear for today? There is no formalization, so rule manuals, formal instructions kind of changes based on the kind of organization that it may have. And then red tape. Red tape is not hierarchy and it's not bureaucracy. What red tape is burdensome administrative rules. So red tape consists of burdensome administrative rules and requirements. So I would consider the fact that every year I have to do at least 3 trainings on Title IX to be red tape. If I've done it once every year, I think I'm fine. And if I've done it once or twice or 3 times over the course of 3 years, I'm pretty sure I have a good idea as to what's going on now in terms of issues with Title IX and harassment. But to do 2 or 3 a year over and over again, and for that to be constantly put onto my requirement as a work check, that's a burdensome administrative rule. It's a rule put onto us by government. Another burdensome administrative rule that we can think of is the idea of, for me, well, that was one. There was another one that came to my mind, but I think I've completely forgotten about it. But that's what red tape is. Things that really shouldn't be there, and when they are there, rather than make life easy for us, they make life more difficult. And then, of course, complexity. Complexity is measured in terms of the number of subunits, levels, and specializations in an organization. So we have a general MPA program, so we are not highly complex. But if we had 100, 200 students and 15, 20 faculty, like a major research organization, we would be a much more complex MPA program. We'd have MPAs with concentrations in maybe nonprofits, concentration in budgeting and finance, concentration in maybe ethics, concentration in economics. The reason we don't have that, these different subunits or specialization, is because we are constrained by the amount of formalization, of course, and of course the amount of basic, professors that we have and the low number of students that we deal with. So complexity, of course, is based on differentiation and specialization based on if you have larger and larger, if the organization is large enough to be able to adapt to the environment that it works in. So these are the dimensions, those are the dimensions of structure. Centralization, formalization, red tape, and complexity. That's how you figure out how the organization is structured. What is the degree of centralization? What is the degree of formalization? What is the degree of red tape? And what is the degree of complexity? It is really important for you to understand, again, for your case, for your organization, for your final paper, these may be important structural dimensions to examine your organization by. They may be, they may not be. I just want to point them out for you. What influences structure? Size, environment, technology and tasks, information technology, and strategic choice. Size. So the larger the organization, the more structurally complex it probably is going to be. The larger the organization, the more levels it'll have, the more departments it'll have, the more job titles it'll have. But what researchers have found is that as an organization grows in size and becomes more and more complex, after a certain point it levels off. So on page 217, the last couple of lines, it says Schoenherr concluded that the rate at which complexity increases with size falls off at a certain point. Organizations that reach this point grow larger without adding new departments and levels as rapidly as they did before. Larger organizations also, interestingly enough, tend to have less administrative overhead. So we think that large organizations have huge bureaucracies that all they do is have this administrative sort of just administrative, making sure that policies and procedures are being followed. But it seems that larger organizations have less overhead than smaller organizations, which is kind of interesting. Size increases the division of labor, obviously, which in turn increases the vertical and horizontal complexity. Relationships among size, division of labor, and the vertical and horizontal differentiation are stronger in federal units doing routine work than those doing non-routine work. So if you're doing routine work, you're obviously a linear technology. One thing leads to another, one thing leads to another, one thing leads to another. You're probably going to have stronger bonds with each other because you're all doing pretty much the same thing. If everyone's doing different things, like we are a state university, we are not doing routine work. So what the MPA teaches is very different than a master's in child development. So the bonds between a professor of the MPA program versus a professor in the child development program are not so strong because we're teaching different kinds of students. We have different requirements, we have different programs. So the more routine the work, the stronger the relationships between size, complexity, and division of labor. The less routine, the less strong the relationships. Environment. So really important, and I think we've talked about this as well. In highly stable environments, you have much more formalized, centralized structures. In less stable environments, you need much more flexibility. So you need managers who are able to evolve and process information rapidly, and as a result, you may have the environment changes the structure of the organization. If it's a really fastly moving environment, it may be a much more flattened hierarchy. If it's a stable environment, it will be a much more your typical, formalized, centralized hierarchy. Technology and tasks. So what is the organization doing? If the organization is doing something really simple, right? Organizations that have the same set of services, such as banks or insurance companies, they tend to have what we call pooled interdependencies, because a bank is offering a large amount of financial products, but at the end of the day, they're all based on the idea of you trying to either place money in the bank or ask for loans. So a bank manager or a bank staff member could be doing one of 5 things, as could another staff member, as could another staff member, and they can work with each other, right? So the technology in a bank, the processes in a bank allow for what we call pooled interdependencies. Also, if you have standardized rules and procedures, just like banks do, or such as the Social Security Administration does, or the DMV does, what we have is our long-linked technologies. This is on page 219, the last couple of lines. And long-linked technologies are those processes that are sequential and are interdependent. So again, the structure of the organization will be such in these sort of mediating technologies with pooled interdependencies and long-linked technologies to make sure that the structure of the organization allows for the flow of information from one side to another. On the other hand, if you have intensive technologies, which means that you have